Welcome to the State of AI, where we explore the rapidly evolving world of artificial intelligence from every angle. Join us as we bring you the latest news, spotlight industry-leading companies, and profile the visionaries shaping the future of AI, robotics, and beyond.
The latest jobless claims data showing initial claims climbing to a 3-month high amid increased layoffs. So how can job seekers navigate the changing job market? Joining me here in studio, we've got Ken Coleman. He is co-host of The Ramsey Show and 3-time best-selling author. Ken, can't imagine a better person to talk to about how to navigate this labor market. On the one hand, we're seeing and hearing from CEOs that I speak to on the show, this idea of just slowing down, hiring slowing because there's concern about policy uncertainty. And then you've also got a little bit of competition from the likes of AI. What is your headline on how consumers should approach this job market?
Well, I think you've got to be really diligent to make sure that you've got your connections up to date. There's an old book my dad gave me when I was 17, written by a guy named Harvey Mackay. And it was called Dig Your Well Before You're Thirsty. And that is true today as it was back then. The idea here is we have a tightening labor market. You just called that out, and it's absolutely true. Certainly in white-collar jobs.
Right.
Companies are just sitting back, especially on today's news. You know, I've been watching the show so far. You've been covering this beautifully. So what are people going to do? They're going to kind of wait and see. And so this is a tightening labor market. So polish up the connections. Everybody thinks about polishing up the resume. No, I want to be connecting all the time so that if I get thrown into a large layoff cut and I'm sitting there going, what do I do next? I've got relationships. Relationships are what puts you ahead of the pack if we see more layoffs. Remains to be seen. I wouldn't panic about it. The other thing is always be upskilling. So, you know, you talk about AI and upskilling. How can I add some more tools to my tool belt? So think of your industry and think of how software, AI, how all of that is changing the game. If you are constantly paying attention to that, then you're going to be at the best position possible to be able to react to whatever comes your way.
And what do you say if someone asks you, should I pivot out of my career completely because of AI? How should people think about that choice?
I wouldn't pivot out of it unless you should. Let's take administrative or clerical roles. I think they're the ones on the chopping block. There's no question that if you're an administrative assistant or in some type of administrative customer service role, your job absolutely is in danger with the advances of AI. So what do? Okay, so where will AI spin off new jobs? Be paying attention to that. Every new technology does remove some jobs, but it always spins off new jobs. If you think about 10, 15 years ago, the jobs that didn't exist. So I'm upskilling to say, how can I learn AI? Because there's always gonna be a need for a human to work with AI. Keep in mind, AI is limited to what a human programs it to do, and many times it needs somebody to help it do what it does. So what does that look like? If you can't find anything, then absolutely be thinking about a trade skill, you know, be thinking about a different industry. Well, for instance, if you're in one of those roles right now, I'd be thinking about electrician, plumber, carpentry work. I mean, that's reality. And we're seeing the younger generation real world skills. The other thing is create a small business. Bring the human touch. So if you've been in clerical administrative work, and you're really good at making sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and you're really good with people. So how can you then go into a different world where you're helping real humans do that? This is not glamorous, but I could create a organizing business. I could create a cleaning business. You know, there are ways to go meet needs. So start thinking across the spectrum what your skill set and experience will allow you to do in a different space.
30 seconds left. What's your biggest advice to someone who hears that and says, well, I can't start a small business. I can't do that. What do you say?
It's never been easier. So instead of thinking about this big business that's going to take care of my paycheck, go, what can I try as a side hustle? I get to test. I'm not expending a bunch of time or money to see if I can do this. Start small, grow real slow. You'd be surprised at how easy it is to build a business that'll sustain you.
All right, Ken, amazing advice, and really appreciate you making time for us, breaking down how consumers can prevent from any AI-related risks to their careers and grow potentially their own businesses. Thank you so much to Ken Coleman.
You know, first you had the CHIPS Act by the Biden administration. Now you have this latest effort on the part of the Trump administration to build this sort of homegrown chip-making, manufacturing industry in the U.S. Is it going to work? Is this, you know, kind of break it down for us?
Well, I mean, so the goal here, at least on this announcement, seems to be leading edge. And like with leading edge, you only have a few options. It's TSMC, Intel, and Samsung. And it's really TSMC. TSMC was already spending a bunch of money here with 65 billion. It looks like from what I'm seeing that the 100 billion that they're going to invest maybe on top of that. Intel was building here, but they're actually delaying their stuff. You know, they actually just on Friday they delayed their Ohio efforts to 2030 or even beyond. So I mean, if somebody is going to build leading edge, a larger amount of leading edge capacity here in the U.S., it probably has to be TSMC. It was already them. It looks like it's going to be more. I would say 100 billion is kind of a lot. I mean, the whole CHIPS Act was $52 billion. I think direct grants was 39 billion, and that was over 5 years for the entire U.S. semiconductor industry. So 100 billion or 165 or whatever it is that TSMC is going to be spending for one company in the U.S. over 4 years is a lot. I think there's questions on whether or not we'll actually need that much, frankly. We'll see what they do over the next several years. But clearly there has been a massive effort on the part of the U.S. government as well as other governments to try to get as much capacity for strategic reasons built within the borders as they can, and looks like at this point it's happening.
Stacey, do you think we ever get to a point in this country where we're truly, totally and completely independent when it comes to chip manufacturing, independent of Taiwan, independent of South Korea?
It's difficult. I mean, as big as these numbers are, I mean, in Taiwan, there's even more capacity installed. And you have to remember, it's not enough to just have like the factories for the wafers. There's the wafer manufacturing, and then there's the packaging, and there's like the raw materials and like everything else that goes into it. I think it's difficult to be completely self-sufficient for everything that we or any country needs to make semiconductors. However, can we get more of that strategic capacity built here? Yeah, yes, we can, and we have been, and it looks like we'll be getting more of it. But we'll never be completely self-sufficient. I think that's a pipe dream.
Well, and Stacey, so we have this effort on the one hand, and then we have tariffs and export controls on the other hand,
Yeah.
of course, right? And we have this report today that Singapore is looking into servers that arrived in Malaysia that were made by Dell and SMCI that may have had Nvidia chips that were subject to those export controls. Nvidia shares are down a lot today, whether it's specifically on that or more generally. How big of an issue is all of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, stuff going from Malaysia to Singapore is okay. I think the worry is that it's finding it's like through the back door into China, right? That's the concern. There are new rules that the Biden administration actually put into place to try to stop that. They're called the AI diffusion rules. They go into place in May, and they will help to block shipments like through the back door into China. But no export controls or anything like that are ever going to be completely airtight. There's always going to be, backdoors and gray markets and smuggling. It's imperative on Nvidia as well as all the other companies in the supply chain to do everything they can to know their customers and to try to control where their stuff is going. And they do. They do this to the best of their ability, but nothing's airtight. I do think it's more of a headline risk than anything else. I'm actually not convinced that there's tons of stuff leaking from Singapore into China. Even Nvidia says, I think they report a lot of revenue into Singapore, but it's a bill to, not a ship to. I think they said less than 2% of their overall revenue is actually going and actually getting directly into Singapore. So I don't think it's that much of a problem, but certainly it makes large headlines. And certainly it is going to get the administration concerned. And this administration may take actions, whether or not those actions fundamentally are warranted or not.
Stacey, for investors right now, who might be long Nvidia, what are the catalysts on the calendar that they should be looking to that could get this stock working again?
Yeah, it's funny. It's not just Nvidia. The whole AI trade looks like it's taking a bit of a pause right now. I think those are just concerns on you have to remember the numbers have gotten so big so quickly. People worry about sustainability. They worry about CapEx growth slowing. I don't think it's rolling over, but certainly you can't grow 1,000,000% forever. Like at some point it slows. And so these are some of the concerns that people have had. And couple this with all of the tariffs and the general, everything else. There's just a lot of volatility and everything that frankly this administration is creating. It's causing issues with lots of like the higher flying growth names. And it's harder to grow when things are that volatile, and they're all kind of selling off. In terms of catalysts, I mean, we just had their earnings last week. There was a lot of nerves going into the earnings. I thought the results were actually fine. I know the stock is sold off afterwards, but the results themselves I thought were just fine. It was actually very quiet. We have NVIDIA's GTC event that comes up in March, and we'll get more color on what's going on and the future roadmap and everything else. And then we'll kind of see how things go, I guess, as we go through the year. We'll look for like hyperscale CapEx guides and that sort of thing. At this point, I would say it looks like in terms of spending intentions, like from the customers, it's still going up, not down. Nvidia looks like they've sort of like released the floodgates in terms of the supply issues they had on Blackwell. They are still supply constrained. They are likely still to remain supply constrained. I actually think the fundamentals look fine, but clearly like people's nerves have gotten a little more on edge, and Nvidia, as well as a lot of the other growthy stocks, have started to sell off.
Well, let's talk about another one of the growthy stocks briefly, Broadcom, because it's reporting earnings later this week after close on Thursday. The shares, along with Nvidia's, are down today. In the case of Broadcom, about 7%, right? And Broadcom, late last year, it sort of came to the market's attention, they're going to be able to make all these contract in-house AI chips for these companies. Is that thesis still intact here? What are you expecting from the numbers?
Yeah, no, I think so. And you have to remember, it's not like they were already making them, right? Their biggest customer is Google. They've been working with Google for 10 years on this sort of stuff. So I don't think that was new, but certainly they were able. It wasn't a narrative that was as widely spread as, say, the GPU narrative for NVIDIA. And so it started to catch people's attention. And they got excited about that. I think there still are some nerves broadly on the overall AI trade as it relates to them. I think there's some nerves about, again, some of these new China regulations, because one of the 3 customers for these ASICs that they have, one of them is widely believed to be ByteDance. And so there's some concern over, especially given some of the new regulations. Remember, it's no revenue right now, but can it come to fruition like over time if those Chinese regulations are in place? So there's some concern there. I get all that worry. In the near term, though, like most of the AI ramp for them this year is going to be Google. That I think is fine. Their non-AI business looks like it's really hit a bottom. I mean, again, they didn't do well last year. Nobody in those markets did. They were down a lot, but they've hit bottom. I think some of the trends in those businesses actually starting to look a little better. We got a little bit more of a green shoots. And then they have the software business. They just bought VMware, and they're killing it on that. It looks good. The stock has been expensive. That's sort of been the one concern that I've had. It's been more expensive than it has been in the past. Valuation, I think, has come down. I don't expect earnings to come down. It's starting to look increased. Most of these names are starting to look pretty attractive to me.
Demand for AI skills nearly quadrupled in 2024. That's up 291%. Joining me now, we've got Misha Fisher, who is the Udemy economist. Misha, great to have you here with us. This data highlights a growing need for AI literacy. So walk us through what this means for the evolving job market.
Thanks, Brad. It means a couple of things for the evolving job market. The 2 big narratives coming out of this report are, first, like you showed, in the last year, we've seen a near quadrupling in demand. That's really telling us that this is not a one-off flash in the pan result just from the release of ChatGPT. People are realizing that these are real productivity boosters. The second big report the second big takeaway that's coming out of it is that it's not just limited to the tech sector. That's where we started talking about this at first. But if you look just in the last quarter, government course consumption's up just about 10%. Transportation as a sector is up about 11%. Manufacturing is up 50%. And then in finance, we saw just in the last quarter a 75% increase quarter over quarter in demand for these things. And what that's telling us is that if you're working in these sectors, you have to be very intentional and think through your productivity that you individually deliver and also the productivity that your team delivers, and recognize that these are tools and skills that augment those things and make you more competitive and make your team more competitive.
You know, as we think to this shift and think about the productivity, I can't help but almost kind of relate it to the era where you were only as strong as the pivot tables that you were able to create in Excel or the macros that you were able to make sure were all interconnected. This seems kind of similar to that. So is it almost like you'll only be as valuable or as productive as some of the prompts that you're able to create with AI? And how can people go about making sure that the prompt knowledge that they have is also translatable to what an organization needs?
Well, you really covered the 2 most important parts of that. So the first is, yes, it absolutely maps to this early story that we saw around computers. It's easy for people to forget that knowledge workers as a class of workers have existed long before we had computers. Things were just done with typewriters. They were done with slide rules. Then in the 80s and 90s, we saw a real expansion of things like spreadsheets, which of course led to the pivot tables you alluded to. These were real productivity boosters. It wasn't until the late 2000s that we even saw the phone-based portion of work-based productivity come into play. And so if you are working in those things, what we saw when these technologies were introduced was an expansion of demand for knowledge workers because people were more efficient and able to produce more. But if you were not on top of that, you might not have seen the career trajectory that you would have expected before the introduction of those tools. So you do have to make sure you have those skills. And you also mentioned the very important word, translate that into the business need. Yes, that is a huge part of this. These tools are interesting and they're fun and you can play around with them on the weekend. But in the end, what a company needs is for you to be able to boost efficiency, boost productivity, make your products better, make your company stronger using these tools. And you really need both sides of that equation. You need the skill set and you need to be able to map them.
As AI skills become essential, what can job seekers and professionals do to stay competitive then?
So as a job seeker or as somebody who's currently in a area where they just want to make sure that they're protecting themselves from downside risk in their employment. We've seen a slew of layoffs across sectors. That is certainly something that I think is front and center of people's minds. It's a 5-step process. So really think through this. So the first is build that literacy. Really learn the fundamentals of what you need to know about the tools generally and also specifically about your industry specific application. The second is actually put that into use. Apply it in your daily work. If your company doesn't pay for it, you can pay for most of these tools for a pretty nominal monthly fee, or of course, there are some free tools available as well. So get that practice. The third is this issue around signaling. If most university programs, if they had one, to run through an undergraduate degree takes 4 years. Grad school takes 1 to 3. The tools aren't even that old. So it really is about those third-party certifications that you can find available. And those certifications are very useful signals that you've learned something, that you've put the time into it. Knowing the skill itself is half the battle. The other half is making sure that employers know you've learned the skill or that hiring committee knows you've learned the skill. So you have to do that as well. The fourth is recognize that this is not the only thing. You still have to be able to communicate, to persuade, to build trust. Those are all universal human things that are valuable across industries, across careers. You really want to make sure that you're developing those soft skills alongside the AI and that you can apply a critical reasoning to the results. If you think about it, in most hiring situations, if you're looking for a job, the hiring review, certainly in tech and probably in other sectors as well, is probably not going to want you to fire up ChatGPT or some other competitor program in the middle of your interview. So you still have to be able to show that you can think. And then the final one is just stay engaged, right? This is a constantly evolving landscape. So you want to really develop the mindset of continuous learning.
Just very quickly, and I got to sprint to the finish here. What does this all mean for wages and the recalibration of the value payout and compensation?
Usually what technology does, and I have no reason to suspect that Gen AI tools are going to be any different, is it increases the variance. If you can use these things, you are more productive, you're more valuable, your wages will go up. If you don't stay on top of these tools, you will become less valuable to employers, and you shouldn't expect to see the same sorts of wage gains.
Dan, it's great to have you on here this morning. So help us make sense of what is happening here. The selling to you, is that justified or is this a bit of an overreaction?
I mean, look, it's a growth scare, right? I mean, if you look at the tariffs, I mean, the concern is like, what does this mean for the AI trade, chips, export controls? It's added uncertainty. But in my opinion, it doesn't change the demand cycle. In other words, this is not going to end the tech bull market. It's a scare, but I believe it's more opportunities than time to head for the hills.
What is that opportunity, Dan? I guess where is that opportunity?
I mean, look, I continue to think Mag 7, when you look stronger and get stronger in terms of this tech trade. I mean, we just came back from Asia, demand 15-1 for Nvidia when it comes to next gen chips. That's not changing. So the point is that I think when you're able to kind of go through periods like this, and I get that there's a lot of uncertainty, but just as we navigated tariffs in 18 and 19, and just like we've navigated other macro issues, that's our view. It is the time to own the winners. You look at these names like an Nvidia. You look at names like Palantir. You look what I believe Apple, which is obviously holding up very strong, and a lot of the other Mag 7, Microsoft, Alphabet, and others.
So, Dan, is this very much more so driven by macro concerns rather than sector-specific concerns?
I think 70% macro. I mean, the worry is like you just don't know rules of the game. So you don't know when you wake up, whether it's US or Asia, what's coming out of the 202 area code. Retaliatory, what does it mean? It adds uncertainty. And obviously, like in the risk on environment, you've seen risk off, you see what happens in the 10-year, and now you're seeing growth investors just get more and more concerned. But when it comes to tech, even on some of the knee jerks like a Marvell or Mongo and others, take a step back. Like the AI trade and the strength is just going to continue to accelerate.
Dan, are those gains though capped until we get some more clarity on the macro front when it comes, especially here, to tariffs?
Yeah, I think it's range bound. I wouldn't necessarily say I'd say it's range bound, but it does speak to our view that like, this is all a game of high stakes poker. If you think tariffs are going to continue and you start the trajectory out, when it lasts through 2026, then all bets are off. But as we all know, I mean, this is all a game that ultimately is about negotiations. That's how Trump goes about it. And my view is being in D.C., called 3-4 weeks ago, and even being in Asia, my sense is like cooler heads prevail, and you're going to get to deals. And I think a lot of this is ultimately going to be bark worse than bite, but it's nervous, and that's creating this sort of angst and white knuckle period that we're seeing.
Dan, I'm curious, how would you assess, or what is your assessment so far of the tech industry's approach here to the Trump administration? There's a report out this morning that tech leaders are going to be meeting once again with Trump's administration next week. What do the next several years look like here under this administration?
Look, it's embracing, right? I mean, much different than sort of arm's length and almost much more of a negative view in terms of first administration. Okay, then there's a few things. One, for the first time in 30 years, tech's leading, in U.S. versus China, because of AI, because of the trade, because of Nvidia, because of ultimately what we've seen in terms of the AI revolution really being a U.S. story, right? Even when it comes to DeepSeek, obviously the Singapore story and everything else, you realize that was a lot different than maybe what initially thought. When it comes to Europe, I think there's a view like they're done with the big brothers watching. Like they want U.S. to have much more strong arm tactics in terms of some of the frustration that tech companies have faced. So I do think it's much more of an embracing of the Beltway and Trump administration, especially relative to what we saw in Trump first administration.
Dan, let's talk about what is going on on a global scale, because you have Alibaba launching potentially this DeepSeek rival. That's obviously causing some ripple effects here in the markets this morning. I'm curious, is it a threat to U.S.'s AI dominance?
See, I don't view it as a threat just because it always goes back to DeepSeek, 6 million not using next-gen Nvidia hardware. I mean, that the same chances that I'm playing in the NBA this week, right? So the reality is that Baba, we're bullish on Baba. And I don't view it as necessarily a competitive threat because it's just a matter of time until Apple and Alibaba partner. And ultimately, Baba is going to be Apple's partner when it comes to AI in China. Innovation is going to continue to increase more and more. These models, more enterprise going down the path, whether it's China or US. Export controls will be there, but the reality is there's only one chip in the world that's fueling AI revolution. It's godfather of AI, Jensen Nvidia.
Dan, outside of the Mag 7, outside of names like Nvidia, what do you like?
I think it's in software. I think you look at name of Messi of AI, Palantir, you look at Salesforce.com. I think Mongo selling off like this is a huge opportunity. Look at names like Snowflake. I think more and more software on the use cases is going to be the ones that benefit. And again, I think we're going to look at this as a growth scare, but not something that dramatically changes our view of the trajectory where tech's going the next few years.